Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, and thank you for joining us. We are continuing our coverage in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. And there's nothing like some eyewitness testimony, which is what you were just hearing. That was the testimony of Susan Follett. We're going to talk to you about how she plays such a pivotal role in this case. And remember, Jeffrey Willis is a convicted murderer who is on trial for the abduction and murder of a woman named Jessica Heringa, a Michigan mother that disappeared from her gas station job in 2013, and her body has never been found. I think a lot of us are left with more questions than we have answers in this case. So to help maybe clarify that, I want to bring in law and crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. Julie, it's great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Nothing like eyewitness testimony, which is what we were just playing. Susan Follett.
Is it eyewitness testimony?
Well, I really want to get that down I want to talk about that with you while I have you. This is a mystery in my eyes. We don't have a body. What evidence do we have? And I know we don't have much time before our break. What evidence do you see that Jeffrey Willis is the person that killed Jessica Heringa?
I think we have a lot of circumstantial evidence. We do not have a witness that IDs this defendant as the person that committed this crime.
She's close to doing it, Susan Follett.
She's close, but she still doesn't do it. But she does offer to the prosecution specific pieces of evidence, including the type of car, certain aspects of the way the individual who we believe is kidnapper looked, that with other pieces that we can talk about, fit into going closer and closer to Mr. Willis being the person that committed this crime.
What we're talking about, for anybody just joining us, Susan Follett was on the stand talking about this mysterious silver van driven by this mysterious individual who may or may not have been Jeffrey Willis in the moments before Jessica Heringa disappeared at that gas station, at that ExxonMobil. That silver van was there and it drove away. Was Jessica Heringa in the back of that van or not? That becomes the question for the jury. That becomes the question for us. And that becomes the question for you, our viewers and listeners. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, there's a lot to discuss. Thank you again, Anthony. Those are the top legal stories of the day here on Law and Crime, and you can go to lawandcrime.com to read more about them. But now let's shift focus to our main case here on Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. That's right, we're going to be covering the Jeffrey Willis case. We're going to continue our coverage of this case about a man who is on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan mother named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. And to make matters even more eerie, her body has never been found. So the question becomes, how do we know Willis did it? And how do we know that this young mother is even dead? Let's talk a little bit more about it with law and crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. Julie, I got to ask you the million-dollar question. We can assume that Mr. Willis is the guilty party, and let anybody who's been following this case can say he is one creepy guy, and he's definitely a murderer because he's already been convicted in the shooting death of Rebecca Blech. But just because he's extremely creepy, and just because he is a convicted murderer, how do we know that he killed this woman? And how do we know, let's start from this, how do we know Jessica's even dead?
Well, remember, you don't need a body in order to go forward with a criminal murder trial against an individual. It obviously helps when you have the body because then you can more articulately make out what the cause of death is, and you can guarantee that the person is dead. But I think in this case, you have the circumstantial evidence that supports it. So what is the circumstantial evidence we have? And we haven't heard all of it yet, but some of we've heard already. We do know from one of the witnesses that the defendant knew a woman that he worked with. She apparently had a gun. And she alleged at some point that he had stolen the gun and stolen items of her underwear. We know that that gun was found in his vehicle, and that a piece of that gun was found outside of the site where the kidnapping occurred. So a piece of the gun that we know he stole is outside of the very place where this young woman was kidnapped. We also know that...
You're assuming, though, that she's kidnapped, because the only evidence that let's just start from the basic presumption that she's dead. Because how do we know that she's dead? We know that she's dead because her, I think it was her husband or her boyfriend testified, she would never have left. She would have never disappeared. She had a son, but I mean, have you seen Gone Girl? Sorry, ladies and gentlemen.
First of all, Gone Girl is ridiculous.
I don't want to spoil the ending, but I'm just saying, you know what I mean?
But there's more. And so additional evidence is there's blood. There is blood right outside of the gas station, and that blood matches her. There you go. More evidence. Yeah. So we also know, and I'll list it for you, but we know from at least one of the witnesses that was there that she describes a silver van or a van that we know from other evidence appears to be the type of van that Willis drove. And we know that because we have another witness, and that witness is the witness that was kidnapped. We know she was kidnapped because she survived. And she's able to articulate that, in fact, the same, a matching vehicle matches the vehicle from the one that was seen at the gas station. You're
talking about this teenager who says that Jeffrey Willis tried to kidnap her back in 2016. So let's just real quick, before we go into the first testimony, we know that Jeffrey Willis was convicted in the shooting death of Rebecca Bletch, and, Julie, correct me, the silver van became the vehicle that he was driving in connection with that
Correct,
murder.
exactly.
We know that he's being implicated in the kidnapping of a teenage girl in 2016. Guess what it's alleged that he tried to kidnap her in? The silver van. And now that silver van was the same silver van that was spotted outside of Jessica Heringa's gas station job.
Exactly.
But there was one little thing that's a little curious. Anybody who's been watching knows that Jeffrey Willis does not have blonde highlights and he's got a beard. The eyewitness account from Susan Follett, who we're about to play in a minute, says that this guy didn't even look like he had a beard and he had blonde highlights.
Well, the one thing there was testimony, and maybe I'm wrong, is there was a testimony from one who used to do Willis's hair, and that woman testified that at the time period of which this young woman was kidnapped, you can call it alleged kidnap, I say she was kidnapped and murdered, that he in fact was getting highlights. So that corroborates the testimony that potentially the person that had the highlights was in fact Mr. Willis.
We're going to talk more about that, what he may or may not have looked like at the time of this kidnapping or disappearance, I should say. But let's talk about what we're really focusing on. It's the testimony of Susan Follett, this eyewitness, a co-worker of the victim, who drove by in the night in question, the night that Jessica disappeared. And we've been playing some of her testimony so far. Here's a continuation of what she saw and what she heard. Here we go. This is Susan Follett. You're listening and watching to the emotional testimony of Susan Follett in the Jeffrey Willis case here on Law & Crime and Law & Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, your host. This has been a really emotional case from many different perspectives. Again, Jeffrey Willis is a man who has been in and out of the headlines, in and out of the law. He has been convicted in the murder of Rebecca Bletch, but now he's on trial for a different murder. He's on the trial for the murder of a Michigan mother named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. And her body has never been found. But despite that, the prosecution is moving forward with their case against Willis, and it has been a bunch of circumstantial evidence that they are using to convict him. And I want to bring back in Law & Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. We're listening to the testimony of Susan Follett. She worked with the victim at the Exxon. She didn't work the night in question. What is sad to hear, and you hear the emotion, is that you have to believe she felt she should have done more. She felt guilty because she sees this mysterious silver van driven by this mysterious individual who the prosecution is saying was Jeffrey Willis, and they believe that inside that silver van was Jessica Heringa, that he kidnapped her from her gas station job. But isn't there a weird aspect to this that she didn't want to really investigate the matter further? She didn't want to go after because she thought that the victim might have been stealing things from the gas station. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm not sure, though, why her thinking that Jessica was stealing things would prevent her from exploring this more unless she thought that the person waiting outside somehow was involved.
Like her accomplice.
Exactly, and so she was concerned for her own safety, which might be the reason. And there was some rumors or some talk that Jessica was, in fact, stealing from the till, although that's absolutely not relevant at this point in terms of this case.
Right.
But that may have been the reason she distanced herself from actually going to explore further. And I think that that's why she feels responsible. She's obviously not, but that she could have done more to save this young woman.
And what's really interesting is you hear the emotion in her voice about this, but it's also sad to hear because she was there at the time, the place. You talk about a witness, whether it's an eyewitness to Jeffrey Willis, but what's really interesting is she said she was driving past and she just felt something was off. She
Right.
felt something was wrong. Isn't that so strange?
It is. I mean, look, I think we all kind of, sometimes we fit emotions in retrospect. So getting home and getting that phone call telling her to come back may have been what jarred her to then rethink kind of what she had seen, and made it more significant than it had been at the time. But of course, I think it's incredibly chilling, and I can only imagine what she's going through every day, thinking about what she could or should have done at that time, and no one would have known what was actually happening at that time.
Chilling is really the best way to describe this case. Julie, stand by. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, there's so much more to dissect in the Jeffrey Willis case here on Law and Crime. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, here on Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, this convicted murderer who is on trial once again. But he's on trial now for the abduction and murder of a Michigan mother named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. Now, despite the fact that her body has never been found, the prosecution is moving forward. And some of the ways that they are doing that is the prosecution is taking evidence from other crimes that Mr. Willis did commit or may have committed and using it in this case. And what am I talking about? Well, as I said, he has been convicted in the shooting death of Rebecca Blech. Evidence from that crime scene is being used now. Also, Mr. Willis has been implicated in the abduction, or I should say the almost abduction, the potential abduction of a teenager back in 2016. Evidence from that crime is being used now. And the prosecution is doing this to establish a pattern that Mr. Willis is a predator of women. Now, that may be all well and good, but the problem is for the prosecution, they don't have a body. And what do they really have tying him to the disappearance of this young lady? Let's talk a little bit more about it with Law and Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. We talked about it earlier. I want to talk about it again. What did Mr. Willis look like in the night Jessica disappeared? We were playing the testimony of Susan Follett, and she said that this mysterious silver van that was outside of Jessica's work where she ultimately disappeared was driven by a man that seemed to have short facial hair, if any, maybe he was clean-shaven, and blonde highlights. Well, anybody that looks at Mr. Willis sees him to be a man with a full beard and rather longer hair, not medium-length hair. But we heard some pretty interesting testimony from Mr. Willis's ex-wife. What could you make of that in relation to his identity?
Right, so she describes him, I forget the pound, you would remember the
300 pounds. He weighed 300 pounds at the time Jessica disappeared.
But she also indicated that he had highlights at the time, which were similar to what this witness can attest to. Remember, and I'm not trying to minimize identification testimony, but this is a woman that's looking at him from a distance, and this is a woman who's not really focusing on exactly what's going on, because remember, had she really known that this was the guy that was taking Miss Heringa away, she would have perhaps gone closer, taken a better look, and had more ability to remember the features.
Drew, I'm sorry to interrupt. Is that a situation, and I know some of our new viewers and listeners are coming through, I don't know what the exact term is, but when a witness tries to fill in the gaps of what they remember based upon seeing how the case unfolds, they see it then in the news and they're like, wait a minute, that's the suspect? You know what, maybe that is the person that I saw. Right. I'm not sure what the exact term is for that. Is that something you're seeing here or no? I'm not. I think she's trying her best to have her own recollection of what happened. I mean, unfortunately, recollection does get impacted by media, news outlets, even unintentionally on the witness's part. But remember, one of the things that the cross-examination is going to hone in on, which it did, is that her recollection was clearer right after it happened, when her description was not quite supportive of it being Mr. Willis. Well, Julie and I keep talking about the testimony of Susan Follett, this eyewitness in the disappearance of Jessica Heringa. Let's play you some more of her testimony from earlier. Well, welcome back to Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, and thank you for joining us. We are continuing our coverage of the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, this man who's been in and out of courtrooms, in and out of the news, because now he is on trial for the murder of a Michigan woman named Jessica Heringa. This woman who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. Her body has never been found. And despite that, the prosecution is moving forward with their case against him. Now, we keep talking about how they're able to do that without a body. And one of the ways they're able to do is look at all of the circumstantial evidence in this case. But one of the other ways that they're able to do it is by using evidence from other crimes that he committed or may have committed now. Remember, Mr. Willis was convicted in the 2014 shooting death of jogger Rebecca Blech. Also, he's been implicated in the potential abduction of a teenager in 2016. I want to talk a little bit about this pattern that the prosecution is trying to develop. Again, I'm here with Law and Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. We keep talking about it. We're going to talk about it a lot. When you don't have a body, you try to go with anything else to tie him to it. What's the prosecution's theory here that there's a pattern? I mean, he's been convicted of one crime here, and he's been implicated in another, and he's on trial for another.
I think, and we were talking about this the other day, I think Mark Eigler was on as well, and we were discussing, you know, the dangers of the prosecution going down certain roads. So, you know, I'm more than comfortable as a prosecutor using other evidence in regards to other crimes that the defendant has committed in order to prove my case if they're relevant. So, for example, when we have the witness that testified that she was in fact abducted, that he pointed a gun at her, we're able to use that because it relates directly to this case, because we have the gun that was recovered and a piece of the gun that's recovered from the scene, and we have the evidence of the toys, the toy box that contained the toys.
Let's break this down. Okay, so we know that Mr. Willis is alleged to have stolen a gun from his coworker.
Right.
That gun, the battery cover to the laser sight of that gun was found at the crime scene,
Exactly.
the Jessica Heringa gas station crime scene.
Exactly.
Let's talk about these sex toys. I know we got to talk about it.
Right.
When his van was searched, there was not one shred of DNA evidence of Jessica Heringa in that van. But man, was there some interesting things.
Sure.
There's a rape kit, there's ball gags, there's rope, there's insulin needles, which became a question because his wife, who is diabetic, she admitted, I don't need the needles, I use a pump. So why does this guy have all of these special tools in the van, but her DNA, the victim's DNA, is not on any of it?
Well, I mean, I think people always assume that it's so easy to get DNA, and it's not always easy to get DNA. Remember that he wasn't arrested, A, immediately, B, he can easily clean up. He can have cleaned the toys that he had. He could have cleaned the vehicle that he had. So the fact that there's no DNA in the vehicle doesn't in and of itself prove that he didn't commit this crime. Now, obviously, as the defense, you're going to be all over the fact that there's no DNA of the victim in this car. But I don't think that excludes him as being the individual that committed this crime.
And let's not forget, Julie, that when a few days ago, when officers took the stand, they said when we searched his van, it smelled like a new car smell, like that new van smell. And he said, look, I just bought the car a month ago, and I got it cleaned because it was really dirty. Suspicious? That was the defense cross-examining a key witness in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to Law and Crime, and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. And that's the question that I have for Julie Rendelman, my Law and Crime trial analyst right now. We're talking about the Jeffrey Willis case. Right now, he's on trial for the murder of a woman named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared in 2013. Now, Mr. Willis was already convicted by a Michigan jury for shooting and killing Rebecca Blech, a jogger, back in 2014. Now, Julie, my question is, you're hearing the defense attorney really go after witnesses under cross-examination in this case, and dare I say it, maybe even putting on a stronger case and really, really dissecting these witnesses more so than in the Rebecca Blech case. Why do you think that's happening?
I think this case is a weaker case, and so I think that there's more holes for them to go after. I think at the end of the day, the circumstantial evidence is strong enough to establish his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But because of these holes, every defense attorney should be doing their darndest to try to. I can't believe.
Did you just say darndest? I didn't want to call you out on it,
but I don't even know what to do with myself right now. You know, but
I feel uncomfortable.
I feel more comfortable for myself. But they're going to do their damnedest to cross-examine the witnesses, especially the witnesses, for example, this witness, who can arguably at the end of the day, argued to the jury, she describes someone that's completely different from who the person is that's on trial. And if you can establish that, then you've basically not been able to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. Well,
we're going to do our darndest to make sure that our audience, our listeners, our viewers can understand what's happening in this case, because there's so many moving parts. But don't worry, we got you covered here on Law and Crime. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, there's a lot to dissect in the Jeffrey Willis case. Welcome back to Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. As we continue to cover the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, this convicted murderer, this man who's in and out of courtrooms, in and out of the news, and now he's on trial for the murder of Jessica Heringa, a mother who disappeared from her gas station, her ExxonMobil gas station job back in 2013. We're left sometimes with more questions than we are with answers. But one of the things that we do know as the prosecution is going after Mr. Willis is that his computer was examined. And we talked about it earlier in the program. His computer had some very interesting things on it. I want to bring back in Julie Rendelman. So his computer, okay? Now again, what is the evidence against him with Ms. Heringa? Well, he had a computer filled with murder videos and a disturbing amount of murder videos.
Right.
He also had a whole collection of Jessica Heringa Facebook photos, a collage. But there was no evidence of her being naked. There was no evidence of her murder. And this folder, this Heringa folder, was only created after she disappeared, not before. What does that tell you?
Jesse, I mean, you know, if we're going to just rely on that, I think we have, you know, any juror. By the way, you talk about the creep factor. I think the creep factor does go a long way in terms of the jury finding him guilty. So, you know, without even looking.
You believe that?
Well, think about it. Without even looking at anything, you know, without the jury even considering anything. The first thing you tell them basically is that the computer has all these images of the very victim that we know has disappeared and has not been found. We also know that there's other victims that he has.
Including Rebecca Bletch, who's the woman that he was convicted of killing.
Who he's convicted of killing. And so, yeah, I don't think that gets you to the end in terms of being able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he, in fact, is the killer. But if you couple that along with the testimony of the woman that saw him outside, along with the evidence that the gun was found, along with the evidence that the ballistics matched the original homicide victim, along with the fact that the kidnapping victim can establish it's the same car, which is the same car that was found at the scene, along with the blood spatter, along with the piece of the gun that was found that is the gun that was recovered into his vehicle. The case is overwhelming against him.
Where's her body?
By the way, I don't know where his body is. I think one person in the room knows where her body is, and it's not me, it's not you, and it's the person that's on trial. But I think that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that, in fact, she is dead.
It's a bizarre case when you don't have a body, but this is really a bizarre case in a lot of different ways. Julie and I are going to tackle it, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about what was found on his computer. And Julie, before I actually go to our next clip, I have to ask you, I was meaning to ask you this, I almost forgot. He came out with a theory, I think it was in the last case, that, oh, I have all this information on my computer because I wanted to help the police. I wanted to help them track and see who did this, who killed Rebecca Bletch. Couldn't he say the same thing now? Who took Jessica Heringa? How do we know that he's just not some concerned citizen collecting all this information?
Because the evidence that you have is not solely the evidence from the computer. So the evidence you have is what's found on the computer coupled with all the other evidence that establishes his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, by the way, in one scenario, I could see him saying, you know, yes, this is me trying to help, but how would you in any way, shape, or form be able to explain that you have two victims' information? And by the way, what about the information that he had on the computer was in any way going to assist the authorities in getting to the person that committed this crime?
Julie, this is why you're a good attorney. You're making some really good points right now. But
I think they're. I wish I could give myself credit, but I think that I think this is pretty straightforward. At least I hope it is.
Well, we'll see. We'll see, because we always hear on Law and Crime, we think a case is straightforward, and then sometimes we're surprised by the ultimate result, the ultimate verdict. What I want to do now is play you the testimony of Sergeant Todd Baker. This is a man, okay, this officer, him and his partner, were responded to a tip about a mysterious van, about Jeffrey Willis driving in a silver van. Remember, the silver van keeps coming up constantly in this case because the same silver van that they saw Jeffrey Willis driving is the same van that they believe was outside of the ExxonMobil station when Jessica Herringa disappeared. Now, this officer, Sergeant Todd Baker, investigated Mr. Willis and searched that van. Let's play you a little bit of his testimony. We can learn what he found. Welcome back to Law & Crime and Law & Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. Now, before we went to that clip, I told you it was going to be Sergeant Todd Baker. My mistake. That was, again, the continuation of the testimony of Susan Follett under cross-examination in the Jeffrey Willis case. Again, Jeffrey Willis is a man who is on trial for the murder of Jessica Herringa. Now, Susan Follett, who we were just playing for you, is the woman, the eyewitness, who will maybe or maybe did not see Jeffrey Willis outside of this ExxonMobil station where she worked with Jessica, saw a silver van, saw a guy that may or may not have been Jeffrey Willis, go into the gas station and then drive away. Now, the prosecution's theory is that's when he kidnapped this young lady, and she has never been found since. Her body has never been found. No one knows what happened to her. But what we're going to play for you in a minute is the testimony of Sergeant Todd Baker, who investigated that silver van. We'll talk about that in a second. Want to bring back on Julie Rendelman, our Law & Crime trial analyst for right now. Again, talking about his identity. That's what the viewers and listeners were just trying to understand. What did he look like? What did Mr. Willis look like in the night in question? Now, one of the reasons I talk about this is because last week we saw the testimony of Jeffrey Willis's wife, okay? This woman lived with him, let's see, she knew him for 18 years. She was married to him for 13 years. She described his appearance, and that's all well and good. This is the same guy that was convicted of murdering Rebecca Bletch. Do you think she had any idea during the course of their 13 years of marriage what he was involved with, let alone having a computer filled with murder videos, let alone having a porn collection, a seemingly rape kit in his van? How do you live with somebody for such a long time and not know?
We hear this all the time. I mean, we hear about serial killers that lived with individuals. You know, I remember a scene from Jeffrey Dahmer when he went to see his father, like, you know, maybe an hour after he had just killed someone, and they sat and talked about McDonald's like it was nothing, and his father had absolutely no clue what his son was up to. It's not unusual. I mean, you know, when you choose to live the life where you are going to be secret and not, you know, provide your loved ones with information, which I assume you wouldn't, or they're not going to be with you, with kind of the personal things that, you know, the evil things that you're going to do, then they're not going to know about it. One could argue that she should have known about it, but we hear about husbands and wives that don't know about things that are lesser than this. And so pathetically, I think that she probably had absolutely no idea what he was up to. Interesting,
though, during her testimony last week, when she mentioned that she thought that her husband was seeing somebody else during the marriage, he actually teared up watching her testify. So hard to understand people. People are hard to understand, ladies and gentlemen. They really are.
It's amazing that that's what would upset him.
Yeah, not the rape videos are on there. No. Now, again, Mr. Willis, this is a better case for the defense because there's no body. There's been no DNA evidence of Jessica Herringa in his van, and that's what I want to talk to you. The van and his ex-wife. Why? Because Sergeant Todd Baker was the man who picked up a tip from the 911 call. Someone made a tip to the police and said, you know what, there's Jeffrey Willis is driving around in a silver van. I know there's a silver van that's being somehow related to this crime. So they went out to his home, and they investigated his van. They searched it. But he was also not so forthcoming about his wife. That's right. Jeffrey Willis said that his wife was inside, and there was some interesting testimony about that. I want to play you the testimony of Sergeant Todd Baker, who's going to talk about looking at Jeffrey Willis's van and what he told him about his wife. Take a look. Welcome back to Law & Crime and Law & Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. What you were just listening to was some key testimony in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, the same case that we've been covering here, the case about a man who was on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan mother named Jessica Herringa. Sergeant Baker, who you were just listening to, was the man that investigated the defendant's home. And did you hear what he said? He said he didn't know that the defendant was married. Now that's important, and that's important because Charlene Bishop, who was married to the defendant, he never said that he was alone. He said that he was alone in the house. He never said his wife was inside sleeping. So why would a man who had nothing to do with the Jessica Heringa disappearance lie to the police? Let's talk a little bit more about it with Law and Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. Why would Mr. Willis say that he was alone in the house when his wife was sleeping in the house? Why would he not even mention her?
Well, I mean, it could be many things. One of the reasons can be because he there's like the consciousness of guilt, so he doesn't want to rouse her, so he doesn't want her to be aware that potentially the police are there to interview him about something that he did that eventually leads to this murder. I'm not sure, keep in mind, I don't think she offers that much when she testifies, so I'm not sure that he's that concerned that she may tell them something that can hurt him. Unless we're talking about kind of the, the type of vehicle they drive or whether he has a gun or anything about in regards to the sex toys that are eventually recovered.
Yeah, I mean, this officer is very important, okay? This is a man who looked at this car, I think it was 12 days after Jessica disappeared. Right. You know what he says, and we're going to play it for our viewers and our listeners? This van that keeps coming out throughout this whole case, the same van that eyewitness saw outside of the ExxonMobil station where Jessica disappeared, the same van that was used to convict Mr. Willis in the Rebecca Bletch shooting. They said that he drove by her and shot her from that van. The same van that prosecutors are saying he tried to kidnap a young teenager in 2016, that same van. That van was was extremely clean. Now, is that because, like, as Mr. Willis will say, oh, I bought it a month ago, and it was really dirty, I wanted to get it detailed? Or is it because 12 days after Jessica disappeared, he tried to get rid of evidence?
Is that a question?
That's a question.
Is that rhetorical? I think the fact that, look, I mean, we can make many assumptions, but assuming that the prosecution is correct, that that truck was in fact the truck used to move her body and eventually dispose of it, then we have to assume that he cleaned it. Because if he didn't, then, especially because we know that there was some blood found outside of the area where the victim was taken, then we have to assume that he cleaned it. And so the fact that it's spotless can support the prosecution's theory that he cleaned it. It can also support the defense's theory that it's spotless because he didn't do anything.
And her DNA, again, I can't stress this enough for anybody who's been following this case, her DNA has not been found anywhere on him. Not on his person, not on those sex toys, not on the van, and that's really interesting.
But it's also 12 days later, and it's 12 days for him to do whatever's possible to make sure that no one ever finds or links him to her body.
But isn't it kind of hard to get rid of DNA everywhere? Or is it pretty easy? I don't know.
It depends on what type of DNA we're talking about. Remember, there was only one small, I believe it was just one small drop of blood that was found from the scene. Is it possible that he used one of the syringes and did something to her that made her pass out, got her out of the vehicle, and killed her elsewhere? And therefore, the DNA that we talk about that would be expected to be everywhere in the vehicle wouldn't be there, and all he would need to do is clean it. Obviously, if he killed her, shot her in the vehicle, then it's going to be much more difficult to get rid of blood from that vehicle.
Yeah, and we can't forget, we're going to play it for our viewers and our listeners a little bit later. These officers, well-trained officers, they said they didn't notice any scratches on his neck, which I thought was a very interesting thing. And we'll talk about it in a minute, Julie. Yeah. We have to go to a break, but when we come back, there's so much to talk about in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. You're listening to the testimony of Sergeant Baker in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to Law and Crime and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. Now, why is this testimony important? Because Mr. Willis, who's on trial for the murder of Jessica Heringa, a gas station clerk that went missing from her job back in 2013, he is giving an account to Mr. Baker about his alibi. Where was he that night? And what did he say? He said he was at the gas station, that he had contact with Jessica, talked to her for a little bit, and then left. That's an interesting set of circumstances. I want to bring in back Law and Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. Okay, I have to make sense of this. He's giving an alibi to police. He played cards, he did this, he went to Taco Bell. Obviously, he didn't tell the police, oh, at the 11 p.m. hour I killed Jessica Heringa. But
he skipped that part.
He skipped that part. But here's the point. He's saying he had nothing to do with her disappearance.
Right.
He admitted to going to the Exxon station. He admitted talking to her. Why? I mean, from both perspectives here.
Well, remember, he doesn't know what they know. So he potentially could think that there's witnesses that have him at that location. And so what he's trying to do is explain why it would be that he's at that location. So obviously, there's nothing more stupid than coming forward and giving the police any statement. Everyone knows you shouldn't say any statements without obviously you know, anything you say can be used against you. And here's the situation where now he's admitting to the very thing that connects him to the crime, because we now have the silver van there. We have all the things that can establish that he is guilty, including the gun and all those things.
You don't believe any of that is legit, that he was playing cards, he went to Taco Bell, he went to the Exxon station. I mean, how does he, I mean, again, how does this timeline doesn't work for you?
By the way, keep in mind, he may be honest about little bits and pieces, but even if he's honest about being at Taco Bell at some point that day, doesn't mean that he is, or negate the fact that he's guilty of the crime that he's accused of. So usually when someone lies, they fit in little pieces of the truth. So I'm not saying he's lying about, I don't really care whether he went to Taco Bell or not. The issue is now he has established that he in fact has been there. And I think the reason he does that is because he's concerned either there's video cameras or a witness or something, and so he wants to go say, oh, let me give an explanation as to why I was there and make it sound like an innocent explanation, not realizing that the only witness that really has him there can't even identify him.
We're talking about that. You're talking about Susan Follett, who was a co-worker of the victim, who drove by at around 11 p.m. hour and saw this mysterious silver van driven by this mysterious person who had very little facial hair, was clean-shaven and blonde highlights, drive into the gas station and drive away from the gas station. The question became, was that Jeffrey Willis? And the question becomes, in that van, was Jessica Haringa in that van? That's the question. And it should be noted that while our viewers can see Jeffrey Willis, and if you look at him today, he has a full beard, he has medium-length hair. There have been testimony that during this time frame, during this Jessica Haringa disappearance, he had much shorter hair, he was almost clean-shaven, and he did have blonde highlights. What I want to do for you now is continue playing you the testimony of Todd Baker. Now, this is interesting, okay? This is when Todd Baker investigates the silver van. The same silver van that Susan Follett said she saw outside of the ExxonMobil's gas station where Jessica disappeared. The same silver van that implicated Jeffrey Willis in the murder of Rebecca Blech. The same silver van that authorities say he tried to kidnap a teenager in back in 2016. So what did Sergeant Todd Baker find in that silver van 12 days after Jessica disappeared? Take a look. That is some important piece of testimony there in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. Sergeant Todd Baker talking about investigating Jeffrey Willis, the defendant, the man who is on trial for murdering a Michigan mother named Jessica Haringa, a woman who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013, a woman whose body has never been found. And despite all that, the prosecution is moving forward with their case. And Sergeant Baker is the one who initially investigated Mr. Willis. And he looked at that van, the same van that authorities believe he kidnapped Jessica Haringa in. And what did he find? That the van was extremely clean and felt that it just was shampooed and conditioned. Now, why does that matter? Well, 12 days before, Jessica Haringa disappeared. Let's bring back in Julie Rendelman. Is there such a thing as being too clean?
Yes, there is such a thing as being too clean. Yeah, I think, and again, one could argue that the officer, has some bias in terms of, wanting the individual that's been arrested to be the person that is convicted. And so, when he views it, and he views it as very clean, obviously that bodes well for the prosecution. Again, we have to go back to the defense's argument, which is just kind of what you were talking about, is it's not so easy to get rid of DNA. And so the defense's argument is, of course, they're going to now say that it was clean because they can't find any evidence that links the defendant to the victim, and so that they're going to argue that it's just been cleaned, and that excuses why it is that the prosecution can't come up with the DNA.
So you've seen cases before where maybe there's no body, there's no DNA attaching her to him, but there's a strong evidence of cleaning, because let's not forget, Mr. Willis's ex-wife, Charlene Bishop, testified that there would be no reason for there to be so many bottles of bleach in their basement, which was found by authorities. There were so many bottles of bleach. She goes, there was no reason there should be this much bleach. Is the evidence of having all that cleaning evidence of guilt?
Well, again, you always talk about these pieces, and so no, in and of itself, having a lot of bleach in your house, I mean, then we can convict my mother-in-law, and so I don't think that having bleach in your house is enough. But when
Let me rephrase. It was in the basement of his grandfather's house. Not that big of a difference.
By the way, but again, by itself is irrelevant. It wouldn't mean anything. It's taking that piece coupled with each piece that leads us to the defendant that that makes the case pretty overwhelming in terms of his guilt. So no, that piece by it in and of itself is not enough to prove his guilt. But that's not all you have.
It's not all you have, but it's really interesting to follow nonetheless. And I got to tell you, this witness, Sergeant Todd Baker, was one of the most fascinating ones from last week, because this is a guy who interviewed the defendant shortly after the victim's disappearance. And we are using the term victim because we are presuming her to be dead. But then again, she may very well not be. There's been some people in this case who believe that Jessica is still alive somewhere. And that becomes a question. It's ultimately up to the jury to believe, is Jessica dead? And is Mr. Willis the responsible party? I want to continue playing for you the testimony of Sergeant Todd Baker. Now again, he already interviewed him about his whereabouts that night. He looked at the van. There are some more key questions that he had for Mr. Willis, and there's also some things that he observed. Take a look. This is very important in the Jeffrey Willis case. Okay, well, we're learning a lot right now about the defendant from his ex-wife. That's right, we're covering the Jeffrey Willis case here on Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Again, I'm your host, Jesse Weber. You're listening to the testimony of Charlene Bishop. Who knows the defendant better than his own ex-wife, a woman that was married to him for 13 years. And for anybody just joining us, we're talking about Jeffrey Willis, a man who is currently on trial for the murder of Jessica Heringa, a mother from Michigan who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. Now, her body has never been found, but the prosecution is moving forward with their case. I want to bring back in Law and Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. Okay, Julie, we just learned a lot. We learned a lot. We learned that, first of all, we learned that these are two people that probably should have never gotten married. They're two completely opposite
Wouldn't
human
have
beings.
set them up, I guess, is the...
Not at all. But we learned that she's diabetic, right? But she doesn't need insulin shots. She has a pump for that. Why were there insulin needles in his van when we know insulin can be used to incapacitate individuals?
Well, I think you just answered it, which is
asking you.
I mean, it's pretty straightforward. The excuse is, obviously, the defense would want you to believe that the reason that the defendant would have insulin in his vehicle was because of his wife having diabetes and needing the insulin. Now that she's testified that she doesn't need those insulin shots, then he has absolutely no non-criminal reason for having those items, and the reason is, and it kind of goes forward into why it is that it was easy to take the victim from the location.
And what about those, we learned a little bit more about those videos that was found. So again, explain this to me, explain it to our viewers. He had all these videos on his computer of swim team meets of young children, but would there be any reason why he should have that?
There wouldn't, although I have to, we were talking the other day about being very careful as the prosecutor in letting in certain evidence that may be more prejudicial than probative. I do get concerned with regards to certain evidence coming in because you don't want an appeal issue. And so I am myself, and again, I didn't hear the actual arguments that were made by the prosecutor to get it in, but I'm not sure how this pushes their case along.
Oh, well, let's think about it. If this is a guy who's a predator of women, right? He's got a daughter. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, this guy has a daughter. Now, he has a daughter, but she's not on the swim team, right? So why would he have videos of young girls at swim meets? Isn't this just going to the pattern of what kind of man he is?
The victim was not a teenager. The victim was
a woman, though.
She was a woman, but I understand what you're saying, but not every piece of evidence needs to be introduced in order to make out the case. And so, when we talk about bad acts, there's certain acts that are separate and apart from the crime itself, that can sway the jury without the jury considering the evidence with regards to this specific victim. And I think there's always concern. Look, anytime there's a conviction, there's a concern of appeal. And as a prosecutor, you want to make sure that all the evidence is not only relevant, but that the probative value outweighs the prejudicial. And this part it just concerns me a little bit that we're going far afield of what this case is about.
Well, the prosecution's throwing everything here. They're throwing in all different kinds of crimes that Mr. Willis may or may not have committed to show a pattern that he is a predator of women, a serial killer in Western Michigan. I want to continue playing for you the testimony of his ex-wife, Charlene Bishop. Again, they were married for 13 years. Let's talk a little bit more. Now, this is really where she gets into a little bit more of the discussion about being questioned, and this is really important because what her testimony said, what she says in her testimony, is ultimately helping the prosecution. So listen again. This is Charlene Bishop, the ex-wife of the defendant. This is some critical testimony there in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. That was Charlene Bishop, the defendant's ex-wife of 13 years. And did you hear what she was just talking about? She had no idea that this man, her husband, the defendant, the man who's been implicated in the murder of Jessica Heringa, a Michigan mother who disappeared back in 2013, she had no idea that her husband had this whole collection of pornography, murder videos, a file titled VIX, maybe short for victims, that had Miss Heringa's picture in it. She had no idea about any of this. I'm here with Law&Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. Why is the prosecution bringing this out to show that his wife had no idea that he had all these videos?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that, I don't know that it necessarily helps them. At the end of the day, it doesn't really make a difference if she knew about it or she didn't know about it. The issue is that he had them. I mean, I guess the argument would be made if she did know about them, then somehow there'd be a more innocent explanation, i.e. if you look at pornography and you share it with your wife, then it's not a secret anymore and it's not such a big deal.
Could it also be that, hey, you might think you knew your husband, well, you sure didn't. I mean, did you ever think that he could be involved in these kinds of things?
Yeah. By the way, I understand that. Although at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter whether she thinks her husband's a serial killer or not. One would argue the opposite and say, well, if she didn't know anything about it, maybe there's nothing sinister about what he did. So, I mean, I think the simple fact is that they're merely asking her, A, questions that would indicate that things he has said to them in the past are lies, and then B, simply the questions of whether he owned a gun or didn't own a gun. If she had been able to testify, oh, yes, we purchased the gun together and we used it at the shooting range and there was nothing sinister about it, that'd be great. The fact that she knew nothing about it, and we know as viewers and the jury knows that this is a gun that he stole from someone that he was potentially obsessed with and took her underwear, then, it plays even better in front of the jury.
Well, his ex-wife right now in this testimony is delivering some really important tidbits for the jury and also for the viewers and listeners of this case. Now, what I want to play for you is some more of her testimony. Now, this part is really important. One of the things that Mr. Willis has been alluded to being involved in is that he tried to clean up a lot of his crimes, that he literally tried to clean up taking Jessica Heringa and killing her. In fact, we heard testimony earlier from Sergeant Baker who said that Mr. Willis's van was extremely clean. Well, Miss Bishop, his ex-wife, talked about a prevalence of Tide bottles being found in his grandfather's house. Let's learn a little bit more about this, and you can be a judge for yourself. Is this suspicious? Does this mean that he had something to do with Miss Heringa's disappearance? Maybe. Let's listen in. You're listening and watching to testimony from the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to Law&Crime and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. So that was the testimony right there of Charlene Bishop, the ex-wife of the defendant of 13 years. Now remember, Mr. Willis is on trial currently for the murder of Jessica Heringa, a Michigan mother who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. And despite the fact that her body has never been found, the prosecution is moving forward with their case. And you can only imagine how helpful Ms. Bishop's testimony was for their case. And what did we just learn? That there were way too many Tide bottles in his grandfather's house. Didn't make sense to her. And what can Tide be used for? cleaning up a potential murder. I want to bring back in Law&Crime trial analyst Julie Rendelman. So again, you heard the wife saying there was way too many Tide bottles. Again, it's been questioned that Mr. Willis covered up the kidnapping of Jessica Herringa, the murder of Jessica Herringa, by cleaning it all up. His van was extremely clean. We also learned that he was the one who originally bought that van, that silver van. My question to you, Julie, is will Mr. Willis take the stand? Because he already took the stand when in the Rebecca Bletch trial, and let's not forget, he was ultimately convicted in her murder. Will he take the stand in this case?
You know, who knows what goes into the mind of a serial killer when they make a decision as to whether to testify.
Shouldn't I say alleged serial killer?
No, I think we're past that at this point. But I don't think he will. I think that. I think in the first case with Rebecca Bletch, I think that there was that he perceived the evidence as being more overwhelming, and so I think he felt the need to explain away certain activity. I think in this one, certainly the defense will argue to him, if I were the defense, there are holes enough to potentially avoid testifying. Let's see if we can get the jury not to believe that this case was not proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
You just need one juror, though. One juror to think that he didn't have anything to do with it. One juror to think that Jessica's still alive.
I agree with you, and that's why you keep him off the stand, because he has no explanation for anything, and so the last thing you want is, as a defense attorney, is for him to try to explain away anything, because he's not very good at it.
Julie Rendelman, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this case.
Thank you.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have to give you a quick update before we sign off. As you know, we were planning on covering the Philip Holland case. Unfortunately, this case out of Wisconsin, the judge has decided to not allow live streaming of this case, so unfortunately we won't be able to cover this one. But that's okay, because we have so much to cover in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. We've been covering it. We'll continue to cover it. We will be signing off right now, but don't worry. We'll be back tomorrow on Sirius XM at 8 p.m., so don't miss it. We'll be back here on lawandcrime.com, so don't miss it there. Our viewers, our listeners, we have so much to cover in the Jeffrey Willis case. I want you everyone to have a great night. Really enjoy it. We're going to be back tomorrow. Stay tuned. Thank you again.